If you're not familiar with this game, this is a game that plays 2 to 5 players. It takes about 90 to 120 minutes to play, and this is a competitive game where players are going to be using worker placement in order to compete against each other within a single factory. And I'll explain more on how the game plays in a second here, but first I want to let you know what the new expansion adds to the game. First, it's going to be adding all the components you need for the 6th player, and then it's also going to be adding something known as the Patriot Box, where players will be rewarded for reporting illegal activity within the plant, because in this game you do have the opportunity to work with the black market. It's also going to be adding a calendar clerk, which is going to modify event cards within the game. It's also introducing 2 new types of workers. There's the specialists, which don't have to wait in line and have a little more freedom than the other workers within the plant. And then there are also the Golems, which are highly efficient workers and do a great job for a specific task, but they will only work on that one specific task until a supervisor moves them to a new one. But I did cover the original campaign back when it launched previously, and I did a pretty thorough job explaining how the game plays, so if you do want to know more, I'll just go ahead and roll that previous footage for you now, and of course you can find a link to the campaign in the description below. And the first campaign we have launches on February 28th, and this is going to be a reprint for Factory 42. And this plays 2 to 5 players and takes about 90 to 120 minutes to play. And if you're not familiar with this game, this is a Euro-style game that uses primarily resource management and worker placement, and it also makes interesting use of a cube tower. And the whole concept of this game is that players are foremen within the Factory 42, and you're trying to manage your workers in order to fulfill orders for your government. The catch here is that your government is also an authoritarian government and has some strict rules and bureaucracy that you're going to have to deal with, and if you're not always able to get what you want, you might want to also engage in some shady deals. And there are a few really interesting aspects of this game. The first is that there is a lot of player interaction. Since all the players are operating within the same manufacturing facility, everything another player does is really important to you when you're trying to decide what you want to do on your turn. Players are going to be moving around different rail cars, generating resources, and you're going to want to pay attention to what the other players are doing. On top of that, each action space does also have a secondary action that only one player can perform in each action space, and it's going to be augmented by the number of players that perform the standard action in that space. So that's just another way that you want to anticipate or take advantage of what the other players are doing. And the other really interesting aspect of this game is the way that the resources, cube tower, and bureaucracy all work in this game. Players are going to be gaining their resources through the cube tower, but the cube tower also represents bureaucracy because certain cubes that go in may not be the same cubes that come out. There are a few multi-level chambers within the cube tower, so as you put your cubes in, some might sit in different areas and not come out right away. So even though you see exactly what goes into the cube tower, you may not see those cubes that went in up to a few turns later, and you will see cubes that were put in on previous turns. Players will be trying to funnel these resources into different rail cars to move them into different manufacturing zones, but players can also use these resources to burn to generate steam. So there are a couple purposes for the resources, and you're going to want to optimize that to try and put yourself in the best position while trying to hinder your opponents. And the game's played over 6 rounds, and there's 4 phases each round. In the first phase, players are going to be drawing an event card, and that's going to have a game-changing effect that will affect all the players. Players will also then draw invention and order cards. The order cards dictate what combination of resources are required to generate different levels of a product to fulfill that order, and the invention cards will allow for special abilities for the different players throughout the game if they choose to play an action to activate it. The second phase is the worker phase, where players will be putting their workers out onto the main board, and players will be putting these workers into these spaces to perform different actions. And those actions can be things like extending your warehouse, gaining new resources, loading rail cars, moving those rail cars into individual player boards, generating steam to convert those resources into products, triggering abilities on their invention cards, or researching new upgrades for their player board. And when you are moving around and loading rail cards, you really want to be aware of what your opponents are doing, because anyone can move a rail card to any other player's personal player board, and that can help or hinder you depending on the opportunities on the table and what that player is attempting to do. Luckily, actions are not actually executed until the following turn, so you can start to see what the other players are trying to do as you're putting your workers out. And then on the third phase, those actions are actually going to get executed in a particular order that is outlined on the board. Once all the actions have been executed, players will get bonus points for fulfilling different orders, and there will also be bonus points to the players that were able to fulfill the most orders. The fourth phase is the cleanup phase, and then the rounds repeat, and after 6 rounds, the player with the most victory points wins the game. And I did mention that this is a reprint, so there are some changes that are going to be coming along with it. For the most part, the gameplay is exactly the same, but they did make some improvements to the iconography. This was a big area of contention in their previous release, so they did listen to their audience, and they did improve that iconography so that the game is much more easy to play. And the biggest change that this campaign is offering is that there will be a Black Market mini expansion, which is going to add some other ways for players to fulfill orders. And of course, there will be some upgrades and stretch goals that players will unlock throughout the campaign, so you can look forward to that as well.